Welcome back to the Band Guide, where we use GarageBand to create professional sounding music. I'm your band guy, Colin, and today I have a really important and actionable video for you. This video is going to be all about how to really use EQ in an intentional way. This is the most powerful mixing tool we have at our disposal. If you learn EQ and use it properly in your mix, it can transform your mix and make it sound way clearer, fuller, and more professional. So you gotta learn EQ. But one of the most common questions I get with EQ is how big your EQ moves should be. So should they be big and wide like this move here? Or should they be really narrow like this move here? Should they be really, really shallow, just a couple of decibels being pulled down or added? Or should they be really big? You know, how do you figure this out? So in this video, I want to give you a hard and fast rule that you should always follow when you're mixing, and then kind of a guiding principle that can help you when it comes to making decisions like this. So let's go ahead and get into it. But before we do, I want to give you something completely free. As I said, EQ can transform your mixes. So I put together a completely free EQ cheat sheet that walks through kind of the baseline of everything you need to know to get going with EQ. There's a link in the description below. It's really going to help you out. It's helped out thousands of people already, so I'm excited for you to get it if you don't already have it. Be sure to grab it from the link in the description below, but let's go and talk about EQ boosts and cuts and how big or narrow they should be. So first thing I'm going to do is take this EQ off because I don't know what this would sound like if I started to play this on this source. We're just going to take it off. We're going to show you a more realistic looking EQ. This is the EQ I've set up on this vocal here. And I'm going to explain a little bit about my decisions in just a second. But first, I just want to show you how much this EQ, even though it's small moves, impacts the sound of this vocals. So if I play a little bit of this verse here, this is with this EQ on. Notice how it's really upfront and clear and professional sounding. Check it out. Instead of crying at the table, if I turn it off, it's kind of dull. Add it back in. Full, upfront, clear. Take it away. No boxing. Doesn't sound professional. Right? That's only EQ. That's the only thing I'm changing here. So you really need to learn your EQ. And I've even balanced the output gain of this here so that it's not adding any volume. It's the exact same volume with this EQ on and off. That's really important. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. So what I want to do is bypass this so this EQ is not on at all. And then we're going to set up a fresh one together. And through it, we're going to talk through each one of these decisions so you understand how big or small you should be making these moves. Now, if you're looking for a video specifically about EQ and vocals, I'll link to one above. I've done one on that already. In this video, I might not go specifically into EQ and vocals, but obviously we'll touch on it throughout this video. But let's go ahead and get into it and start with the first thing you should be doing on most of your sources. If they don't have low end, like there's no sub information in this vocal, for example, I'm going to use a high pass filter just to make sure that it's clean and clear in the bottom end, to make sure that nothing down here could possibly be getting in the way of my bass sources. So that's the first thing I do. And with this, I just want to make sure that it's not getting in the way of the vocal. If I were to pull it all the way up to here, or even here, the vocal starts to sound kind of thin, which could be really cool. If you need that in your song, that might be the right thing for you. But 9 times out of 10, I'm just trying to make sure that I'm not having any sort of rumble down here, just cleaning that all up. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go ahead and look at our first EQ move. Now, generally speaking, I like to make my cuts first. But before we even do that, the first thing that you need to know is what I consider to be a hard and fast rule with EQ, but with mixing in general, and that's that you should always do as little as you can, but as much as you need to. So if I can get away with just doing a little cut like this, I'm going to do that. But if I need to do a big cut like this, I'm going to do that. Same goes with width. If I can get away with it just being kind of narrow like this, I'm going to go with that. But if I need it to be bigger and wider, I'm going to go with that, right? So as little as you can, but as much as you need to. And you'll see that play out in a few different ways throughout this. The second rule of thumb that you should know, so the first one is a hard and fast rule, as little as you can, as much as you need to. The second one is more just a kind of best practice, and that's that generally speaking, our cuts are going to be a little bit narrower and our boosts are going to be a little bit wider. And you'll see why that is in just a minute, but that's just a good rule of thumb. I break that when I need to. If I need to have a really wide cut, I do, right? If I need this cut to be really wide like this, I will do that. You'll see that on an example here in a minute. But I start out, generally speaking, with smaller cuts and wider boosts. Okay, let's get into it. And the first thing I'm going to do is a cut to see if I can cut out something I don't like in the source. To me, if we listen to this, which you should always listen before you just start EQing, listen to this and see if you can kind of identify what you don't like about it.
Instead of crying at the table.
Overall, it's not a bad vocal sound to me at all, but there's a little bit of kind of a boxiness to it. So if we take this EQ move, we're going to find that in this mid-range, lower mid-range area. So if you kind of just divide this into thirds, you have bass and sub information, mid-range here, and then bright information up in the high end. And in our lower side of the mid-range, there's going to be kind of this boxy sound. Check this out.
Instead of crying at the table.
Just a little bit nasty sounding, right?
Instead of giving out the names.
So what I want to do is I want to set this a little bit narrower and try to find where it sounds particularly bad to me.
Instead of crying at the table.
Just, to me, probably somewhere around here. If I go lower, this sounds kind of full to me. Check this out.
Instead of lying that you're stable.
That's where you get the body of the vocal.
Instead of pushing it away.
If I get up here, that doesn't really bother me. It's not that muddiness that I'm looking for. So I'm looking for something around here.
Instead of crying at the table.
And what I want to do is make a cut
Instead of giving out the names.
that only impacts the range that's bothering me. So to me, it's this range right here. Once I start to get past it in this direction, it's fine. If I get past it in this direction, it's fine. So I want to just really focus in on this range right here.
Instead of crying at the table.
So I'm just going to be doing a bit of a cut
Instead of giving out
in
the
this
names.
range.
Instead of lying that you're
And
stable.
what I'd like to do is try to find as little as I can. So sometimes I might make it a little bit
Instead
extreme
of crying at the table.
and then scale it back.
Instead of giving out the names.
If I start to get down here, it starts to sound a little bit
Instead of lying
unnatural.
that you're stable.
But if I have it somewhere around here,
Instead of crying at the table.
it still feels very natural. So as little as I can, but as much as I need to. So somewhere around there is feeling good to me. Now, the second thing I want to do on this particular vocal is add in a little bit more of that body. Give it a little bit more body to this vocal. And we're finding that in the lower range here. So
Instead
kind of just
crying
below
at the
this.
table.
Now, you could do this either with a bell and have it set kind of wide, but one thing I often like to do if it's going to be here, everything here and below, is just use a shelf. This is the widest thing we have because it just continues all the way down, right? So all I'm going to do here is pull this up until I'm getting the body I want,
Instead of crying at the table.
and it's impacting what I want it to,
Instead of giving out the.
and I want to make sure I'm not adding in any of this up here that I don't want, or if I am, as you can see, this curve kind of goes past that, I might need to bring this back down a little bit more.
Instead of crying at the table.
So I'm going to make this just a little bit sharper.
Instead of
so I can make
giving
this
out the
really
names.
wide and gradual, or I can make it really sharp like this where it's going to just have a sharp edge up. So there is width to a shelf as well. It just continues from here all the way down.
Instead of crying at the table.
So something like that adds some nice body to me,
Instead of giving out the names.
right? Starts to feel a little bit fuller.
Instead of lying that you're stable.
Might not be for you, but I definitely like that on this vocal at least. Okay, now the next thing I want to do on this vocal is pull out a little bit more presence. So I like to do this in the context of the mix because it doesn't matter how it sounds in solo, it matters how it sounds all together. So here I'm going to play a little bit.
Crying at the
I'm
table.
going to make this a little bit narrower, and I'm going to play around until I find where this cuts through particularly well and sounds good on the vocal in the context of everything else.
Instead of crying at the table. Instead of giving out the names.
So once I start to get up
Instead of
here,
lying that you're stable.
it sounds a little bit harsh,
Instead of pushing it away.
a little papery
You
almost.
say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's just
That's a little
to get
telephony. So I'm really kind of in this range.
out of the thick of it. And now you're saying you're proud. Yeah, you're saying you're proud. We're all getting sick of it, yeah.
But, I don't want to be bumping into this area right above where it's not necessarily doing something I like. So I want to make sure that I'm not going down into this area or up into this area too much. So just a gradual bump up in this range that does sound good to me is working for me. And then finally, I want to do a similar thing up here in the super bright, airy frequencies. So I'm just going to boost this kind of exaggerated and find where it sounds good up here.
Instead of crying at the table. Instead of giving out the names.
So a little bit thin,
Instead of lying that you're stable.
almost shrill right there, but somewhere around
Instead
here
of crying at the table.
just adds a nice air to it.
Instead of giving out the names.
And I just bring it down until it's not too much, as little as I can, but as much as it needs. Now, the last thing you want to do before you do a check with this to make sure that you like it better, which you should always do with your EQs, is balance the volume. Because we're adding volume here at these frequencies, we're going to be adding volume to the source. Sometimes if you're doing a lot of cuts, you're going to be taking away volume. So you might need to add volume on this output volume over here. So what I like to do is listen to it in solo, and I just like to check and make sure that it's the same volume roughly off and on. So this is on.
Instead of crying at the table.
If I listen to that again,
Instead of crying at the table.
A little bit quieter, not massively. So I'm just going to bring this down about a half decibel to start. This is on.
Instead of crying at the table.
This is off.
Instead of crying at the table.
So I think it come down just a little bit more. So sometimes this is just a bit of trial and error, but you'll find it.
Instead of crying at the table. Instead of giving other names.
Yeah, so it feels fuller when that comes in, but not necessarily louder now. So now let's listen to the context of the mix.
Instead of crying at the table.
If I turn it off here.
Instead of giving other names.
Right. Add it back on.
Instead of lying that you're stable.
Turn it back off.
Instead of pushing it away. And you say it's just to get out. Yeah, it's
just fuller, clearer, more present. Now, that's the way I approach my EQ moves. This is really, really important to understand. You don't want to do a larger boost or cut than you need because you're just going to be adding or taking away from something that might otherwise be working well on your source. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is you may have seen, even on some of my videos, some super, super sharp cuts like this. This is what's called surgical EQ, and this can be helpful. If you're comfortable with this type of EQ already, I would recommend you continue on with this video. If you're not, go grab that free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below, and you can stop watching this video. But this can be really helpful in specific instances. So let's actually jump over to another session. I'm going to show you a really good example of this. Okay, so here we are, and this song is just a basic acoustic guitar recording, and I have two EQs on it. The first one is doing just basic tonal EQs, or second EQ rather, is doing just basic tonal EQ, kind of like we saw in the last video. But the first EQ is doing these very specific notches. Now, this is surgical. I'm just attacking specific things that are ringing in the space that it was recorded. So if you only work with virtual instruments, you're not going to have any issue with this. If all you use is GarageBand Drummer and the keyboard in GarageBand and things like that, then you're not going to have any issues with this. But if you record things in the real world, then sometimes you can get these resonances that build up, and this can be the best way to address them. So check this out. If I play a little bit of this acoustic guitar with this EQ off, so this EQ is currently off, notice how it just has this ring to it. If I turn this EQ on, it cleans it up completely. Right? So if I exaggerate this here, I'll just turn each one of these up. What you'll hear is that ring is just really extreme when these are up. I mean, that's terrible, right? Right, so I'm exaggerating it, but it's there even when these EQ moves are not there. If I turn this totally off and now listen for those frequencies. Now, this is partly one reason why we don't do really narrow EQ bumps, because it can kind of add this weird resonance if you do that. But it's also the only time that I ever get this narrow with my moves, if I'm trying to notch out one of these resonances. So I'm being very surgical here, finding the specific frequency and then cutting it out as narrowly as I can. So I'm going to turn this EQ off. We'll do one fresh one, and we're just going to find one of these and notch it out. Now, with this, you want to start by setting a tall point, and you want to have it fairly narrow, but not crazy narrow, because anything sounds weird when you boost it when it's super narrow like this. I mean, that just sounds super weird, right? So that's not going to help us. But if we make it a little bit wider, then we can listen for where we hear an excessive ring. So right there. Now, as we saw, there's a few in this one, so there's going to be a few points where I hear it. But this one's really bad to me. That one's kind of bad to me. But this is the main offender to me, right? So what I want to do is find where it's the worst and then make this really narrow. So all I'm going to do here is now cut out that one frequency. And I want to make sure that I'm right on it and that I'm not getting anything that I don't want. And then I'm going to bring this down and just cut it out, right? Make sure that's really narrow. And here I might do a really big cut, but I want to still do as little as I can, but as much as I need. How much better is that, right? Just that one cut. Again, this is something that if you're new to EQ, don't worry about this. You could really make your mix sound weird if you do this unnecessarily throughout it. But if you're having something that has this very specific problem, you can do these surgical cuts to try to find and isolate and remove things that are getting in the way of your source sounding clear. But the same rule applies. I'm doing as little as I can, but as much as I need. And that's how you need to be thinking about this throughout. Okay, if you don't already have it, be sure to grab that free EQ cheat sheet from the link in the description below. Before we go, I want to hear from you. How have you approached making your EQ cuts and boosts before? When I was first starting out, someone told me that I should never make an EQ cut or boost larger than 3 or 4 decibels. And so I followed that for a while, but honestly, that's kind of terrible advice. It's not that that's not a good starting point or jumping off point. And there's a lot of EQ cuts and boosts that I do that are in that range, but sometimes you just have to do more. As we saw here when we were doing this notch cut, I'm doing way bigger than 3 decibels. And on some of my cuts and boosts in my sessions, I might be doing 9 decibels, 10 decibels, 12 decibels. So it's fine as a general rule, and you should always do as little as you can, but sometimes you need to do more, and you should always do as much as you need. So as little as you can, as much as you need. Again, let me know in the comments below how you've approached your EQ cuts and boosts up until this point. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.
One thing